Scott, are you happy for us to record this?
Absolutely. Right, I think I've finally got everything in place. Yeah, apologies. I've also been slightly in back-to-back meetings today.
No, don't worry. It's okay.
Getting all the stuff in place. So, Rich, can you just give me a bit more context on what it is I'm contributing to, so to speak? What's the bigger picture here? Is this a one-off talk or is it part of a series?
Well, you've taken the introduction right out of my mouth because this is the first of 3 sessions specifically focused towards arts PhD students. The first 2, today and the next one, which Ross, who's here, I think, will talk about at the end, are focusing on practice research and how it relates to PhD submissions. And then the final one in May, I think Ross is going to mention that at the end as well, is on IP and arts PhDs given by Met Kopochnik in the law school. So it's a series of sessions for arts PhD students. But I know that there were a couple of people, I can't remember if they're here yet, outside of arts who are joining, someone from FEW, which is education, health and well-being, and a few other things. So it may well be not just art students. You should talk as if it were, but hopefully we'll get a nice range of students here from different disciplines. So I think, yeah, people are just a couple more joining. So my name is actually not Fab's Resource. Oh, I wish it were. My name is Richard Glover. I'm a reader in music and I lead the Centre for Practice and Research in Performing Arts at the University of Wolverhampton at Prespa. Thanks very much to all of you who are here. It's wonderful to see a nice range of people. And I've just been talking about this as a series. Then I mentioned that Ross Pryor will talk about the next session at the end of this one, but there'll be emails advertising that in due course. It should also be in the PhD student almanac that a number of you will have gotten through in early January, I think. So Scott McLaughlin is joining us from the University of Leeds. Thank you very much, Scott, for joining us today talking about articulating practice research. It's going to be a nice informal session. I think Scott will talk for a while, and then Madison Miller has very kindly agreed to share her work, and we'll have a bit of discussion on different approaches to documenting that. But what I hope is that some of you other PhD students out there will then want to start contributing, asking anything about your submissions. Scott will talk about his background as well, I think, but he's enormously experienced in terms of different ways of tackling the notions and documentation of practice research. So it would be really nice to get some discussion going as we progress through the session. That's enough from me. Scott, I'll hand over to you.
Great. I'm going to preface things. I'll preface things a little bit with just a bit of background on me and where I'm coming from in this. I'm also going to drop one link in right off the bat, because some people, you might want to follow on with some of the things. There's a bunch of links in this presentation. I'll drop in the presentation itself later as well if you want to go in and take a look at the rest of it. For positionality point of view, I'm a composer and practice researcher based in the University of Leeds. So that means most of my knowledge from this comes from within the discipline of music and how practice sits in the discipline of music. One of the really interesting things about practice research in general as a relatively young methodology is that the approaches taken across different fields of art and outside of art fields are often slightly different. There's overlaps, there's plenty of overlaps, but there's also slight differences too. So it will be interesting, particularly to talk with people who aren't coming from music or who are coming from a slightly different disciplinary perspective later. I think the key thing, though, I would want to take away from all of this, though, is that we are all practitioners. We all have an artistic practice that we do that is often externally facing to our professional and audience networks. And we also have our researcher side where we're contributing to field in some way that relates to our artistic practice. Our artistic practice is how we do that contribution. So in terms of articulating, that's the thing I'm interested in talking about. The talk I'm going to give, the link that I've just thrown in there is only because I refer to it in the first page or so, so you can go take a look. It's mainly a set of resources that you might want to take a look at, a couple of which I'm going to draw on quite heavily in this talk. I'm going to close the chat until I finish talking, so I won't see anything that comes in there, but hopefully there'll be questions arising from that anyways. So the actual thing I'm going to talk about today, this idea of articulating practice research, is something particularly I want to talk to PhD students about, because this is, in many cases, the real challenge that you've got. A lot of people come in with an existing artistic practice that they do, and again are used to dealing with that on a professional level as an artist, as a musician, as a painter, as whatever. But then to frame that in a way that is useful to the research community, that makes a contribution to research, is something that takes a bit of learning. And depending on where you are in that and who's supporting you, etc., it can be alienating at times. And lastly, the problem largely being that since there's such a dearth of really easily accessible models on this, it's hard to know sometimes if what you're doing is the right thing, while also wanting to maintain the flexibility that we have in artistic practice, that there isn't just a simple methodology box that we can squish everything into. The nature of arts practice is that we're all doing slightly different things and we're doing them our own way. So you want to try and retain that sense of artistic integrity and flexibility and personal voice while still making it something that can communicate with other researchers to give them a path to follow. So that's my kind of take-home point right off the bat. The other thing I'll say is that I'm going to talk a lot about ref, partly because I want to situate this talk in terms of things you might be leading towards. If you're doing a PhD now, that means there's a strong possibility, not necessarily, but a strong possibility that you want to continue doing research in an academic context post-PhD, whether that's postdoc, whether that's applying for a job in a university in a lecturer capacity or something else, or even being a researcher that doesn't work in a university but still contributes. All of these things necessitate being involved with what the REF considers to be research. So I'm going to use the REF, which is the Research Excellence Framework, which is the national level audit that happens every 5, 6, 7-ish years in this country. And it's something that universities are incredibly dependent upon, because the results of the REF more or less define how much money you're going to get in a certain extent. So I'm going to use ref definitions for a lot of this also, though, because I think they're very simple and straightforward. The ref itself, on a labor-intensive and bureaucratic level, can be a difficult and traumatizing even period of time, but in terms of what the ref asks for on paper, that's quite easily transferable across all sorts of disciplines. So let me get into it. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes. I'm going to try, I'll rattle through a couple of these things quickly, but you'll get the slides later, so you can always go back and take a look at the detail if you want to. And of course, happy to expand on any of it if I go through it too quickly. So first off, that thing I just dropped into the chat is just a reference to, a link to this page, which is a small blog that I run because I sit on the Royal Musical Association's committee and run the practice research aspect of that. So part of my job there is to make sure that practice research has a voice. What I've got here is just a link to some resources. The Visioning the Future stuff is really worth looking at. Lots of great talks in that. Prague UK is really excellent because it's essentially a bunch of ref panelists and ref heads who came together to say, let's try and get a little bit more crosstalk across our disciplines, but also let's stop thinking of research as just being for ref. Research is life, not just for ref. So it's about making our practice research more findable, more searchable, more easily contributable to. The last thing, there's a bunch of things there, but I note that the most important thing isn't actually on this list. I'll link to it later, but I'll talk to it a few times, which is last year's research report by James Bully and Özden Sahin, which is basically an attempt to explain what practice research needs to be for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and a way to try and bring together practice research across a bunch of different disciplines and even outside of disciplines. That is a very important document for the next few years. It's also a long and somewhat tedious document, but that's because it's good at its job. I'll summarize some bits of it as we go, but I'll drop you a link to that later. So, key thing here I want to try and hold in mind is this idea of reviewability. Now, again, this might seem like something that's a little bit far down the line if you're just doing a PhD at the moment, especially if you're only starting a PhD, but follow with me and you'll see the point I'm getting at. This is from a post by Sarah Watley, the dance professor at Coventry, and it's from the Prague UK blog website, which is a bunch of, actually, there's some really good blogs up there. Anyways, what she says is, practice is emergent, iterative, often multiple, and, to put it bluntly, unless documented along the way of the making, might already be too late to put forward for ref as practice research, in a way that makes it reviewable. The opportunity to reverse engineer the output that may not have intended to be research but becomes researchful in how it develops is what often happens, analogous to writing the papers once the ideas have already been formulated, consolidated, and tested. But the many elements that might constitute the work might already have disappeared if not collected and organized along the way. Now, the reason that I'm sitting on this word reviewable is because if you're an academic in submitting something to the ref, the whole point is that the thing is something that someone can understand where the research is in this. If you're doing a PhD, the equivalent to this is that when you finally submit your PhD, as well as having the excellent practice in it, it needs to be clear what it is that you are communicating forward to whatever the field that you're trying to contribute to is. So reviewability for you becomes a communication thing about here is why someone would care about this. Here is why this matters that I did this, not just for me, but for other people that it'll contribute to. And the point...
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. We can't see your presentation. Can you just try sharing again?
Did it disappear? Or was it never there?
I think it wasn't there. We did see it initially, but before you and then you dropped out. Let's try again.
Let's try that again. Thanks for the interrupt. That's useful. Okay, in theory... Sorry, I think my screen's just getting confused. Let me just rewind a page.
There we go.
Are you seeing the full page or the...
We can see it's not full page, it's the slide and then next slide, that page. But we can see it.
Is that any better?
There we go. Yeah, great.
Thanks for that, Rich. And also noting that, of course, if you're trying to wave at me, I can't see the human faces on screen, so shouting was the right thing to do. Okay, so this idea of reviewability then, this point that whatever, and the point that Watley is trying to get across is this idea that whatever it is that you're doing, keeping track of it along the way and keeping track of it in terms of this is what the research is, as well as this is what my art is, but keeping track of documentation, etc., and having a clear sense, even if it's not immediately clear in the moment, of how this is contributing to a research field somewhere along the way is super important. Brief thing on some ref stuff. So a couple of things that came out of the 2014 ref was that a lot of people who were contributing practice research, as they say here, the best outputs in practice as research were distinguished by a clearly articulated research objectives. I won't read all of these out, I'm just going to pull out the highlights. They also say what was excellent was when it was well edited or annotated or some other way to facilitate access to the research inquiry. They say the most successful portfolios helped the assessors by providing a pathway through the material, submitting it so that it was clear what the research contribution was and why specific pieces of evidence were provided. And they also make the point that on occasion, research was documented, well, that's less important. Concision and selectivity in the presentation of portfolio materials was often key to the clarity of the project's research imperatives. And lastly, they make the point that more generally, 300-word statements, which is the 300-word statement that you contribute along with your research to explain how this is research. They were too often displayed a misunderstanding of what was being asked for and provided evidence of impact instead, or a descriptive account akin to a program note, rather than making the case for practice as research. The sector still has difficulty distinguishing excellent professional practice from practice with a clear research dimension. So this is a general point that while the practice that you're doing, the difficulty that we often face is not separating the things out as in this is a practice, this is a research painting I made, and this is a professional painting I made, but that all the things that we make in our practice all can equally be aimed towards a professional audience, a public, etc., who care about the artwork for its art value, or also a research audience. Both of these things happen at the same time. It's just a question of communicating in those two different directions. So part of doing a PhD in practice research is about trying to have that research audience in mind at the same time as the other. Now, for some people, it's a real difficult trick to learn, to have those two things happening at the same time. Some people prefer to split these up a little, do artistic work and then work out how it connects to research, etc., or even the other way around, do research work and then work out what kind of practice they need to do to bring that out. But those two things have to exist in there somewhere. So the reason that I'm pointing this out in ref terms is that well after PhD, there are plenty of people out there who are still not quite getting this right. The other resources I was pointing to were, as I said, the Bully Shaheen report, which has a link there. I'll put that link up later. As I said, it's a very long report, but there's really good stuff in it. And I'll refer a little bit more to that as we go on. There's also, in terms of purely thinking about articulation, there's a really good editorial in JAR, the Journal of Artistic Research, issue 24, that's worth looking at. And as I said earlier, there's those general resources. So one more quick blast through some ref things. And this is why I said earlier that I think ref is a really useful starting place for this, just to give you a hook to hold on to know that at least for the next 10 or 20 years, until they change it, that this is something that the whole of UK academia is considering as the ground description of research. So ref says, for the purposes of ref, research is defined as a process of investigation leading to new insights effectively shared. That's it. There is something where you investigate. There are some things that come out of that are insights, and you share those effectively. The insights, they may at some point in this only be insights for you, but if you can see that they are also insights that other people could learn something from, or that add something to the totality of knowledge in the world, that allow people to hold on to something and bring themselves along, then finding a way to share that is part of the job. So for a PhD, this is not dissimilar. In a PhD, you're asked, in pretty much all cases, to define in some way a contribution to the field. So the question really as a PhD student is, what is the field that you're contributing to? And then how do you articulate your contribution? And with the practice that you're doing, this will be the generation of insights, the process of investigation. But I think part of my point here is to say that along the way, you also need to have that effectively shared part and articulating part in mind, that there's a process there also of working out, how do I get these ideas, these insights out to the people who are going to find them interesting? And that's the field. And sometimes that field shifts around. A lot of the time we start a PhD, certainly I know when I started my PhD, I was thinking purely in terms of certain type of composition. By the time I got to the end of my PhD, it was much clearer who the people I wanted to get it to were, and they weren't necessarily the same people as I started with, but in some cases they were. And I think the discussion later, maybe this is a useful place to try and come back to for everybody, is to try and think about, can you articulate for yourself what your contribution is and what the field is? For a lot of people, that doesn't necessarily become clear until towards the end of the PhD. I'm not going to bounce through these. You can go look at ref criteria if you want to at some point, but the thing that's useful here is in, again, when we submit to the ref what the panel is asked to look at, or sorry, what we're asked to explain, if we submit a 300-word statement, which is usually in cases where if I just submit, say, a piece of music, I know what the piece of music was doing research-wise, but anyone looking at the piece of music doesn't necessarily see the same things that I was intending. Art, by its necessity, art is something open. So the 300-word statement is supposed to make clear what the research is doing. And it does three things. It explains what the process was. What were the questions? What were the issues? Was there a process of discovery? Were there methods, methodologies, etc.? You could put a little bit in here about context. Whose work are you drawing on? Whose work would you relate this to? All of these kind of things. The research insights. What were the findings or discoveries that came out of the process? And then the dissemination. How were these things effectively shared? And with something like artworks, again, this is where the professional and the academic can get confused in a sometimes unhelpful way. So if my string quartet that's very research insightful gets 20 concerts, that's great. 20 concerts, 100 people per concert, which is wildly optimistic for a new music concert, but there you go. But so there's 2,000 people that have been effectively shared with. But was I sharing the research or was I sharing the artwork? Does anyone in those 2,000 people walk out of that room seeing the same insights that I see in it, or seeing the process, or seeing how this contributes to a field? Not necessarily. Maybe if I provided some kind of talk, etc., that might have been useful, but also maybe those 2,000 people sitting watching a string quartet aren't necessarily the field that I'm trying to contribute to. So the effect of sharing is not just to do with getting your work out in the world, it's to do with identifying who can this work be a change for? Who will see this work and go, oh, I didn't think you could do it that way, I'm going to go and do something different. And this is also where we get into the difference between impact and academic type beneficiaries, in that there may be other composers who are not academic who see my piece and decide to change what they're doing because of it. Wouldn't that be nice? So there is certainly an overlap and a gray area in terms of the differences here between impacting and having and contributing to a field. But from a PhD perspective, I think you can concern less with the impact side and be more concerned with, in a purely academic sense, what other academics or what academic fields of inquiry are going to find interest in what it is that I'm doing, and how do I then effectively share it to them? How do I get it across to them in a way that is most clear? Which is not necessarily through text. Text is very important and very useful and is usually going to be required somewhere, but there are other ways to make things effective. A little bit on James Bully and Özden Şahin's practice research report. I'm just going to skim through a few things here just to highlight the ways that this can be useful and helpful in terms of articulation. One aspect is that they attempt to come up with a simple definition for what practice research can mean. As they describe here, it's an umbrella term that describes all manners of research where practice is the significant method of research conveyed in a research output. By output, we're talking anything, so a piece of music, a painting, whatever, a journal article, a monograph. This includes numerous discipline-specific formulations of practice research which have distinct and unique balances of practice, research narrative, and complementary methods within their projects. The term is non-capitalized in general usage in common with other research fields. The other thing that they attempt to define is this idea of a research narrative. Again, they call it just a practice research output. In a practice research output, a research narrative may be conjoined with or embodied in practice. A research narrative articulates the research inquiry that emerges in practice. And the idea here is that these definitions are something which can be applied across pretty much all fields. So they're loose enough to work in any artistic discipline, and equally outside artistic disciplines. Clinicians, medical people, anyone who has a practice that they are doing things through and where text is not necessarily the best way to convey the research. The other thing I'll just briefly point onto here again to reflect this back into PhDs. In some ways, a PhD is a research, the written commentary aspect of a PhD is a research narrative. It's something where you're creating a narrative that relates to the practice that you're putting forward, explains a little bit of where it's coming as a context, but most importantly, it articulates the research inquiry, the people reading this commentary and using that then as a way to as a lens through which to look at the artistic works that you've submitted. They're doing that so that when they listen to or look at or etc. whatever art you've submitted as your PhD, they can see, because you've explained, how this is research and what it contributes to. Because that's always going to be a large part of the Viva conversation. Briefly, just skipping sideways onto something from Ben Spatz, who's an absolutely wonderful theatre and embodiment academic based at Huddersfield. Spatz says, if the documented practice is indeed a research practice, then the landscape of experimentation of which it is part will not be identical to the landscape of cultural performance in which it appears. From an epistemological perspective, the important context is not in the minds of witnesses, for example, other performances to which they might compare it, but in the flows of technique that structure it and in the communities of knowledge that are invested in these flows. Which is really just another way of saying what I've been saying for the last 20 minutes or so, that there are two audiences, that the cultural performance, the landscape that is there is probably overlapping with, but not necessarily exactly the same with, as he describes, the landscape of experimentation. And that's the research landscape. People who are making experiments in this area and contributing to an ongoing articulation of knowledge. As he says down the bottom, the important context is not in the minds of witnesses, so audiences, people who are seeing this, etc., but in the flows of technique that structure it and in the communities of knowledge that are invested in these flows. And that's really the key thing, communities of knowledge that are invested in these flows. So who is the community or communities that will be invested in the flows of research that I'm doing? When I make my string quartet that does all sorts of interesting things that I find insightful and I can't see anyone else doing exactly the same things, who are the people that are going to be invested in that? Where is that room full of people where I could walk in and say, check out what my string quartet does, and all those people will turn around and go, ooh, we didn't think you could do that. Or I've been trying that for years, but I never quite got it to work. Or I've been trying something similar, doesn't do it the way you do it, but I'm aiming at the same thing. These are the communities of knowledge that you're trying to reach with your PhD. And if you're lucky, during your PhD, you'll already be in conversation with some of these people, whether they're sitting next to you, whether you're collaborating with them, whether they wrote a paper that you really liked and you sent them an email. They are the communities of knowledge that you're trying to get to talk to. And post-PhD, those are the people you might end up collaborating with, whether it's writing a book or writing a play or whatever. So that's pretty much the end of what I was going to talk about. The reflection to take forward in this maybe is to ask, the simple question is, what is your practice? Most of us can define that fairly straightforwardly, even if it's not that easy to articulate to people who aren't us. But knowing what it is that your practice is helps you know maybe what the field of, what the communities of practice you're trying to get to are. And also, what's the relationship between your practice and your research questions? Again, research questions are somewhat nebulous things that we tend to start a PhD with, and they kind of drift and grow and flow and change across a PhD. So they're sometimes hard to pin down, but being able to articulate how is the practice answering those questions? How are the questions flowing out of the practice? What's the set of relationships that's going on there? And the question then that I haven't asked, which is perhaps the hardest one, but maybe also the one that's least easy to answer until you've done it, is how do you articulate these? And that's maybe something we can play with in the conversation a little bit. So I'm going to assume, yes, that was the end of what I was going to talk about. I'm going to unshare myself. Hey, I had a very tiny panic moment there when I stopped the thing and thought Zoom had gone. And I'd just been talking to nobody for about 20 minutes.
We might have let you know, maybe.
I wouldn't have known. My phone is off. Anyways.
Scott, that's great. That was very rich. Plenty for folks to think about. I actually want to just, we'll just have a little pause. I think a few minutes. Maybe there's any questions that people might want to ask, either through audio or type it in the chat. Questions or comments, because there's quite a few things to bounce off from Scott's presentation there. You said, Scott, you'll send through the slides, which would be great.
I have just thrown them into the chat, and there's also a link for the Bully Shaheen report if anyone wants to go and read that, which I thoroughly recommend, at least the first half of it.
Yeah, as you say, it's heavy going, but that's because they did a thorough job. Yeah,
at least it's very clearly signposted what's in it. It's that they do a really good job of summarizing all over the place. It's worth knowing going in that more than 50% of it is actually aimed at the librarians and repository builders, because there's a big conversation about how we put this in a repository somewhere.
Well, I hope we come on to that later, because I think, as you said earlier, the dearth of models, and that's partly what prompts this a workshop like this and the next one next month, because in a good number of other subject areas, there's a lot of very clear standardized examples of how you construct your PhD. Yes, yours is going to be different in a nuanced manner, but there are clear set methodologies. Whereas exactly the way you described, Scott, it's not antithetical in the arts, but it's different. And so collating those models, those examples, so that all your PhD students have some idea of some kinds of things that have gone before and how your work can situate within that. It was, like you said, Scott, it's still an early days, really, isn't it? It's a developing field. So if anyone's got any questions, just type them in or come on audio. If not, we'll move on in a couple of minutes. You use the Ref 2014 report, which I did, and I gave a practice research talk to the PhD students a couple of months ago, and they actually do quite a good job, I think, being quite distinct. And there's that slight air of irritation of, look, we said in 2008, for goodness sake, there's a difference between practice research and professional practice.
But I think that dearth of models is really part of the problem here, that no one sees what that looks like. We as artists have tons of models of what it looks like to write a good string quartet and get a good performance and make a CD and all of these professional directed things, but we don't have good models for what it's supposed to look like as practice. And I think particularly it's problematic for PhD students because it's so hard to find other people who are doing things like you. In most cases, if you're a STEM researcher, you can hit the journals and you can search keywords for the things that you're looking at. And no matter how niche you're doing, you're going to find connections, but we don't have enough journals. Most of the practice research out there isn't even in journals. Most of it is sitting in university repositories with almost no way to find it.
Yeah, I'm glad you said the Journal of Artistic Research. That's a great repository, folks, if you don't know that already. Yeah, some really innovative approaches to layout as well, visual layout on the screen, and that yes, those examples are just not there.
Yeah, I also agree with that. I found it difficult finding artists that I could reference my PhD research, and when I was doing research on exactly what is a creative practice, it's a relatively new term. What started maybe in the 70s, 80s didn't really take off until more recently. And so I think that's another reason why it's difficult to find other practice-based researchers out there.
Yeah, I agree, Madison. There's one thing I want to, Scott, I want to ask you before I think we'll switch over to talking a bit more about Madison's work. It's your point about the research audience. I think the way you said it was all really clear. The examples you gave, you gave the specific example of your work, and the examples end up being other composers. Yeah. And part of the reason that most of us are here is because we like presenting to other people, or we like making stuff that gets presented to other people in some form. And that mode of presentation is often not primarily practice research outputs, but rather, let's say, concerts or gallery exhibitions. And I do think what you said it later at one point, though, focus on your viva, that's your research audience. which is a useful, or did I interpret that maybe? But you know what, I think maybe I interpreted that as a focus on that's someone who to imagine as your research audience, as sort of a subset of your research audience. But this crossover between the research audience and the audience at your exhibition or the audience at your concert or whatever it may be, I don't know, I find it slightly difficult to pass the two. What do you think?
You're absolutely right, and actually, sorry, just briefly to go back and say hi, Madison. Thank you for that comment. I completely agree, and it's a huge problem, and I'm sure we'll come back to it in a few minutes. But to answer that question about audiences, yeah, and why I shook my head a little bit when you said when you were saying what I had said, I think when you're a PhD student, the Viva really is it's your end level boss. It's the people that you are trying to reach to a certain extent, or at least to convince that, look, this matters. And certainly to wherever your external is, that's probably going to be someone who is in the community of practice that you want to be reaching. So if you're thinking of an audience that you want to make clear articulation of your research to, certainly your Viva panel is going to be the people you want to clearly articulate that to. But I think I shook my head only because I was then questioning what I had said, because then thinking, but of course it's, that they're just a boss, they're a gatekeep. When you get past them, it's the people that you really want to be talking to are that community of practice outside that, the larger community, which is why then I went back onto that point about trying to find those people who care about the stuff you're doing, because it's interesting to them too, and you all want to push forward on doing something, even if you're doing it in different ways or for slightly different reasons or slightly different techniques, etc.
Yeah, and that's where the Ben Spatz comes in really nicely, this idea of landscape of experimentation as opposed to landscape of cultural performance. I think that word experimentation is so useful, so useful there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, let me get a link to Ben's book in there. The Blue Sky Body one is really excellent, but in some ways he explains it more clearly in his previous book, which was What a Body Can Do, which is also really excellent. Because it's to do with embodiment and all of that stuff, but it's not really. It's really to do with research and what is research when we're dealing with bodies and technique and the technique of those bodies, etc. Of course, I can't now find it directly in front of me. Keep on talking, I'll find it.
Yeah, that's all right. Well, you can always add it to your presentation. If you send it over, just put a link on the slide. Okay. Scott will never have 20 concerts with 100 people in the audience.
Not a hope.
All right, let's bring in Madison. Madison, thanks so much for agreeing to not be the guinea pig, but to share your work and talk it through with Scott. So I will take a back seat here. I just want to ask Madison a couple of questions just to get you to introduce your work, and then Scott, you can take over. Hi, Madison.
Hi.
Thanks again. Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, I'd like you to introduce your work, and also you sent through some specific work through to Scott to look at before today. It'd just be useful to know what it was about that particular work that you wanted Scott to look through.
Okay. Yes, so my name is Madison. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Wolverhampton, and my focus is on soundscapes. And soundscapes are kind of like landscapes, but with sound instead of like the visuals. So it's a matter of just being in an environment, being in that immersive experience, and experiencing the sounds in that environment. So then what I do with the environments that I field record is I take photos as well, and then I create like an alternative soundscape experience, and I upload those onto YouTube. So I did send over some of my YouTube videos. I do have a presentation prepared as well if we want to review that, but basically I can discuss, the creative process, like how I do it, what motivates me to do it, and maybe key terms of my research as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So let me just share this. Okay. Can you all see my screen? Just nod your heads. Okay, thanks. So in this presentation, like I said, we're just going to talk about my research, but I'm going to focus more on the creative process, about like the self-meditation walks that I take in nature. So some of the key terms that I have for my research are obviously the creative practice, which we're, practice-based research is what we're talking about today. And I think one of the good things about creative practice is that you're not only researching it, but you're applying it to your research. And so throughout the 3 years I've done this project, I've noticed that there's definitely been changes in the way I think and compose my work. So I did review what soundscapes meant, and then self-meditation is something that I'm exploring currently in my research. It's definitely part of my creative process, and it's funny because it's one of those things that I just do naturally, but now it's time to kind of sit and understand, why do I do this? And so I'll kind of explain that a bit more. I do have anxiety, and so I like to relax or find different ways of relaxation. And one of those ways is getting out in nature, doing my walks, getting in the sun, getting that vitamin D, and then also like immersing myself in that environment. So I like to listen to the sounds, maybe the birds chirping or like the water moving in a creek or something like that, kids playing, even like all the sounds help ground me as well. And so during the process of this self-meditation, I'm able to find relaxation. But what's really interesting is that there are other artists out there who discuss, what relaxes them. And I just have a few different examples here on the screen. For instance, they say yoga or travel or reading, some say cooking. But a lot of the research that I found is oftentimes a lot of these artists do things that take them out of maybe the environment that was making them stressed, or kind of taking their brain out of that environment and immersing themselves in music, nature, meditation, things like that. So it draws some conclusions, but there is actual research to kind of back up the claim that mental health and relaxation can be found in nature. So Mind the Mental Health charity obviously has a lot of information about this. But yes, being out in nature can help improve your mood and reduce those feelings of stress or anger, and also encourage those feelings of relaxation. So that's basically the beginning of my creative process. The starting point is, okay, I'm feeling very anxious. I need to calm myself. Let's get outside. And so I'm really in a nice location right now because I have a lot of nature reserves and things around it, even parks. So I'll get out, do my walking. Sometimes I go long distances to enjoy nature in other ways, like I'll go to the beach or find other different parks in the area, or even like ruins, like old buildings and things like that with ruins and like nature surrounding it. So yes, I go through the process of just immersing myself in a different environment. And while I'm doing that, I take field recordings of the sounds that I hear, but I also take photos. And I usually take my camera with me, but if I don't, I'll take photos on my cell phone. So this is on the screen photos just from my cell phone, easy, simple photos, just to document the walking experience. But I get a little bit more creative when I have my Canon camera. So yeah, you'll see a lot of photos in the presentation of actual photos that I've taken during these walks. And then once I'm, done, relaxed, I like to go home and kind of process everything, just relax a little bit more, maybe have a cup of coffee. And then I typically upload these collections of photos and field recordings to my laptop. And then that's whenever I start developing like an alternative soundscape. So an example would be like if I would record sounds like at a park, what I want to do is then add maybe loops or beats to it and kind of create a different sonic environment. I don't want to just say, oh, I did this at the park and just use that like raw file. I want to add a little bit of my own spin to it, just because I found, especially during COVID, I really enjoyed listening to different soundscapes that had the repetition. So it's like easier to focus, and it's a more predictable thing for me. And that's another thing I found in my research, is that predictability also helps with relaxation. So then after I'm done developing the soundscapes, typically I'll use like Cakewalk. It's like a free editing software tool. I'll use Adobe Photoshop, Lightroom. Then I'll use Premiere Pro to like make it into a video form and then upload on YouTube. And then if I have time, I'll kind of write a blog about the experience. And this is where like the autoethnography aspect of my creative practice takes place. And so this is going to be a really big part of my PhD research, is documenting how I do it, and then how I've changed throughout the process, and how I make the decisions that I make, who influences me, all that stuff. So it's really important that I maintain this kind of archive of my thoughts, feelings, all the, beyond the academic research that I do. So we'll go ahead and listen to, I guess, the soundscape in a minute, but I'm going to talk about one of them, for instance, which is the heavy rain and piano soundscape that I made a few years ago. Like I said, the materials that I used are typically Cakewalk and Adobe. And this is an example of like a photo set. So I was out walking, and this was actually shot in Slough. They have a lot of really nice parks there as well. So I went to Slough, and this is just an example of photo sets. Typically I'll take maybe 200, 300 photos, but I mean, this gives you a good visual of kind of what I do. I'll take a few different photos from different angles, different lighting. And then whenever I upload them, that's when I kind of narrow down which one I think would be best fitting for the soundscape that I'm creating. And then, like I said, I upload it onto YouTube, and then I also do the blogs as well. You can see the finished product in the photo I decided to go with. Because I was using rain sounds, I wanted to show rain, and so I chose an image that had the water droplets on the leaves, and so I felt like it all kind of related together. I know like everyone is a different type of learner, and even though this is a project mostly based on my creative process, I like the idea of helping inspire relaxation in other people. And so if they need associations to kind of help them through the song or the soundscape through visual associations, like I'm really happy to do that because I really enjoy photography. So I think photography and music really fuse together. And I mean, you can see it in things like video games or movies. Like music and images are always paired together to kind of evoke some sort of emotion. And so I'm just kind of doing the same thing, but in a different way. So yeah, that's my research. That was the end. So I guess we can open it up and have like an informal discussion about all of that.
Sorry, I totally lost my unmute button. I knew it was in there somewhere. That's really great. And I would listen through two of the soundscapes that you sent over as well. And yeah, I can completely see the kind of practice that you're doing. And are you 3 years in now? So are you in write-up point?
No, I'm actually going to take a writing year. I think that, well, one, COVID impacted my work. It changed the direction of, it changed my proposal a lot, let's just say that. But it honestly changed it in a good way. I think it helped me refine it a bit more and help focus in a direction that would, you know, benefit like me in the long run and stuff like that. When I first applied with my proposal, I was focusing on things that that would require maybe like a clinician on my team, and it would be more of like a health aspect. And I wanted to do something artistic, not necessarily saying, I didn't want to make bold assumptions like this is what I do and this is, I help people relax or relieve anxiety. Like I don't want to make bold statements like that. Art obviously it causes a lot of different people to feel different ways. And so yeah, renovating the proposal made it more arts creative based practice rather than clinical stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's often a dilemma that people have coming in, because we look at our artistic practice and we think, well, how can this change anything? Or how can I turn this into a PhD? I better dress it up as science. I think that happens quite a lot. And it ends up being very difficult then, because if you don't have a collaborator that can really do that for you, then you're trying to work in a totally different field from what you're used to. Sometimes it can work out really well, of course, but I think it's quite a dilemma. While you were talking, I was diagramming because I like diagrams. I'm all about diagrams. but it was interesting trying in picking out the way you were talking about it. If we're thinking about articulation, in trying to see what were the fields that you were articulating, what were the things that seemed to come out strongly in what you were doing, and inevitably in these things, there's always there's always overlaps, and they always point in different directions, and you can't just always pick one strong thing and say this is where my work has impact. But at the moment, in where you're sitting, who, in an academic sense, who do you think this work will matter to? Who will share your fascination?
I mean, in an academic sense, I feel like sure, it's a music focus, but in general, I think it's just like any art practitioners, because I think it goes to show that you don't have to do something sciencey to get a PhD. You can do something that you love and enjoy. Not saying science isn't something people love and enjoy, but you can take art and really work with it and transform a PhD into your own personal experience. And I think like it will influence people in the long run, because like I said, the term creative practice is a relatively new one. And so it's just going to keep growing from here if we have these people influencing one another. Like, I always wanted to be in academia. I can't explain it. It's just something I always wanted to do. And so I was in my undergrad for a long time, and I just took so many classes because I found so many things interesting. And so people who are like me, who just want to keep going with the academic thing, this is another alternative for them. If they're not like a science-based person, you know, it gives them an option to pursue what they want to do the research they want to do. And it's nice because it's like you don't necessarily have to adapt to the mainstream either. So yeah.
In terms of the, I mean, I completely agree with you. It's in the sense that it's the whole point of doing a PhD is that well, apart from the output side of how it's useful for other people, but there's also the aspect of it about you come into a PhD already being an expert in something in your practice, etc. But then by taking it on as this isolated project of a PhD, you take those skills, you focus them in a certain area to do a certain thing. And it's not always clear until you're halfway through, or sometimes most of the way through in my case, before you know what really the thing is. I mean, when I did my PhD, I had the vague sense the whole way through that all of this music I was writing had connections, and I could see the connections, but it was really hard to articulate. And it was only when I had to sit down and write the damn commentary that I was really able to put it in a place and say, right, okay, this is the important thing. I can still remember the wonderful moment when I went to a lecturer who was not one of my supervisors, and I just wanted a different set of eyes on it. And I said, can you help me narrow things down a little bit? So he said, sure, bring me along some ideas of like where you think your focus is and what things are important to put in the PhD, and we'll go through it. And I turned up at his door with a 4-page long bullet point list of all the stuff I thought mattered, and he looked at it and he laughed and he just threw it in the bin and said, let's make this a little smaller. So coming down to those 2 or 3 things then that seemed to be the things that I really wanted to articulate, it really was the end of the PhD before I worked out what that was. What about you in terms of the research questions? I mean, as you said, things changed a little at the start and twisted around a bit. Now that you've done so much more practice and you've got this focus on the documentation, on the autoethnography, on the meditative aspects, on the soundscape aspects, where are your questions now? Is it clearer to you what this is articulating?
Yeah, I would say that the questions are definitely a lot clearer, but I think it's important throughout the process is to constantly look at your questions and review them too, because I would say like a year ago, one of my questions was, what is a soundscape? Okay, well now I know what that is, so let's think of something else to focus on. I think it's important to, obviously talk to your supervisors and get their feedback on everything, but you as a researcher, maybe every 6 months, like kind of look over and see, okay, did I answer these questions? What else do I need to look into? And that's why I said earlier, now I'm looking at what is relaxation? What does that mean to me, the general public, etc. Because it's like I've already explored the soundscape aspect of it. It's like, okay, now it's time to talk about the feelings evoked from it. And it's interesting because within that time, like obviously the thesis title has changed too. So I think about like 2 years ago, I think I was focusing on this term called like sound walks, and instead of that term, I think I'm just gonna go with soundscapes instead. So it's just I think that's another nice thing about autoethnography, is because you do all that self-reflection. But it's funny because like I look through my blog and I can see, oh my God, where I started. And it's like, I'm really happy I didn't go in some of those directions that I went when I first started. And, you know, everyone can like look at my blog and see the process. It's not academic at all. It's like just me just, you know, talking, and it's like a diary. But I would say, like, you know, I have really bad handwriting. So this is a really good way of me being able to read my notes and kind of review where I started and where I'm at now, and obviously where I'm going. And I guarantee you, like, even when I'm done with the PhD, like, there's going to be even more things that I think about, like, oh, I could have did this differently, or I'm going to try something new. And I'm kind of thinking about it now, but it's important that with the PhD, you kind of stay focused, and towards the end of it, not try like dramatically new things, because yeah, definitely not do that, just because once you narrow down your focus, you just need to commit to it too. Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like as a PhD supervisor, you know, when you're in a band with somebody, you're all writing songs, and at some point you say, yeah, that's a great song, but maybe it's not for the band. Maybe that should be for your solo album, which is not dissing the song. It's just saying that the band is doing a thing. And it's kind of the same with PhDs. We get a million ideas, and at some point you have to say, that's a great idea, but maybe that's for a project after the PhD or outside the PhD, so you manage to keep that focus. But I really like that thing that you said about it coming into view in that way. Like, there was a point where you had to say, what is a soundscape? You had to reflect on that. And partially, I think what that makes me think of is to what extent some things in a PhD are just tools to get something else done. So is the soundscape for you a tool to get to meditation? Would that be a fair way of saying it? Or maybe it's the other way around?
Yeah, I think that's also a question that I'm in the process of trying to understand. I would say that with I've experienced CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and in that time, like they teach you different coping mechanisms, and one of them is like using your senses to kind of ground yourself. And obviously, that's one of the things that I do, is go outside. But it's one of those things where sometimes my social anxiety is pretty bad that I can't really leave the house. So it's like, okay, well, what do I do when I don't leave the house? Like, obviously, there's different forms of meditation, and so one of the things is music. Like, has always helped me relax. So I'll put, you know, like soundscapes on that I find from other artists, or just simple noises like maybe birds chirping, or like I like fireplace sounds right now. I don't know why. It's just something I've been listening to. But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, when I'm at home, there's different things that I experience that like ignite my five senses. One of them being like the process of making coffee, drinking coffee. It's kind of a contradiction, because coffee can make anxiety worse, but it's just like the act of being immersed in some sort of experience with the sight, sound, smells, etc. So on one hand, even though these soundscapes help me relax, I mean, obviously there's other ways that I have to relax if I'm kind of bound to not leaving my house. And so I really like the idea of helping other people. I mean, I kind of went into this PhD project focused more on helping others. And so that's why the clinical stuff came to be. But it's like, even though I genuinely want that, I can't, as far as my PhD research, to make it art-based, I can't really focus on whether or not somebody with anxiety can obtain relaxation. So I do have the like option for people to give me their feedback if they ever want to. Like, I have my website where they can send emails to me, or like I'm on a whole bunch of different social media, so they can always just message me or whatever. And I think that having that open dialogue would be interesting, and maybe collecting feedback would be interesting, but it's not vital to my research.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think as well, in relation to the clinical, while as a society we tend to valorize the clinical as being the correct way to do something, of course, having a practice of making soundscapes that people find helpful and being able to talk anecdotally about how you or other people find them helpful is just as valid. The point of clinical stuff is to be able to create objective knowledge. The point of artistic practice research is usually not to make objective knowledge, because it's not something we have the We don't have the methodologies to do that. But that doesn't mean we don't create knowledge. It's just that it's not a particular type of scientific objective knowledge. When part of the reason I asked the question about Soundscape being tools in that as well is going back to that question of contribution to knowledge, etc. And it's sometimes difficult in our work because we have so many overlapping nebulous things like this. I'm not saying it's easy if you're a stem cell researcher because you only think about stem cells. Of course, there's all sorts of stuff going on in there too. But if you're thinking, if along the way, if this PhD is a contribution to knowledge in terms of soundscapes, so you have to ask the question at some point, what is a soundscape? And that means knowing that other people also ask the question, what is a soundscape? And at some point there is there's a community of knowledge out there for whom the question, what is a soundscape, is the only question that matters. That's it. That's all they care about. They go to the pub, they talk about soundscapes. Do you feel that that is the group of people that you want to contribute to, or do you feel, or maybe or is it the group of people who talk about meditation, or the group of people who talk about immersion, or about autoethnography? You've got all of these different communities of practice that relate. If you had to invest all of your money in just talking to one of them, could you pick one?
I think that's a difficult thing to decide, but I would say like I kind of made a decision with I think my second annual progress review was like, what's your contribution to knowledge? And I think what I said with that one, obviously this was a year ago, so things have changed, but what I said was the term soundscape exists a lot in science, and it's really lacking in the art world. And it's interesting because soundscapes, like the term exists in a lot of other like niche areas, like architecture, for instance. And so everyone kind of has a different view on it, and it's a matter of taking that information, understanding where they're coming from, and then kind of coming up with my own definition. So, I mean, in a way, it would be beneficial to target artistic folks, but I think in general, the contribution knowledge would be allowing more art to enter into the definition. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that completely makes sense. If I think of people, like there's a bunch of people down in Goldsmiths, for example, like John Drever and I've forgotten the names of all of them now, but they're really soundscapey people in a specific kind of musical or Murray Schafer type sense of the word. But as you say, the word comes up everywhere. It's something we are all constantly thinking of. But for you to then have this double-barreled thing where you can contribute to the conversation on soundscapes and what that is, because as you said, you have your definition and it works for what you do. And there's a weird kind of web of effects then between your definition and John Drever's definition and Murray Schafer's definition and all of these people within one bubble. And then there's all these other bubbles out there that have slightly different approaches. So the architecture plus sounds people, their view on a soundscape will be related to that, but not exactly the same. And because you've got this meditation thing coming in as well, I think that offers a really unique perspective. So for people like your John Drevers who are thinking about soundscapes in a very musical, artistic sense without necessarily thinking of the meditative aspect, you offer a really interesting additional thing there. So I think what I'm getting at is that even when you find these communities of practice, there's always still that point that you're not just mimicking them. You're not just kind of dressing up like them to fit in. You have your own specific, unique thing to offer that makes bigger whatever it is they're doing. Which the flip side of which means you're always slightly an outsider, because even when you find your community of practice, you're still doing something slightly different to them. But yeah, you have the conversations.
That's part of the PhD journey as well. For me, is that I kind of have to figure out where I situate myself with other artists. And so it was interesting because some of the research that I did was, okay, figure out who are the big names in soundscapes, or before that, sound art, broadening the spectrum a bit more. And I think you're correct. It's like, it's not the same, but there are slight differences, but I am part of that community. It's funny because like there's this big debate on what sound art versus soundscape and things like that. And yeah, I think it's interesting because it's like, even after I experienced some of these artistic works, then you go into their interviews and then you figure out, okay, why did they make the choices that they make? And it's like, after kind of understanding how they talk about their work, it made it easier for me to talk about mine. And I think it's because when I went into this PhD project, I wasn't like really a music-based person. I was more of like philosophical person, I guess. But I was able to learn terms and stuff based off of these interviews that I was watching from others, and just immersing myself in different kinds of exhibits. Now, because of COVID, a lot of the exhibits that I experienced were like online based, or I would have to research it and get interviews of maybe people who attended to kind of explain the experience. But now that COVID's lifted, they have like this one, they have like this sound room at the British Library, which is interesting. And then they also have a couple of different immersive sound experiences at the Tate Modern that are open. And so I was able to do that like 2 weeks ago. And so I think it's important to just constantly be involved with what's out there, because you never really know what you're going to find, and all those things will influence you, or at least teach you something new that you didn't know before.
Yeah. And I think sometimes what they teach you as well is they help, that word you said a minute ago about situating. When you see what someone else is doing that superficially looks like what you're doing, but then you look up close and you look at interviews and you talk to them and you see that it's close, but it's trying to get at something slightly different, or it has a slightly different concern. I think that really makes a difference. So when you talk about meditation, but also are talking about immersion, that's really interesting, because there are, of course, lots of people talking about immersion in music, but a lot of them are coming from like game audio mechanics and that very psychoacoustic sense of it, rather than necessarily how it relates to a sense of self or any of these other things. So there are all these different perspectives, and I guess well, for you, do you pick the perspectives that are most useful for you?
I think anything is kind of useful, honestly. I hate saying it that simply, but it's like, even like watching, I think, the Beatles documentary on Netflix or something, and understanding their creative process and how they came about making their music, how quick they are at coming up with lyrics and things like that. I think just even seeing that is useful, because it kind of makes me think about my research in a different way. Well, okay, of course, there's the time that I do to these field recordings. That takes a lot of time, and sometimes the time varies. Like I could be out there 30 minutes, it could be out there 2 hours. I don't really know. I don't know. But when I am sitting down, sometimes I can think of a beat really fast, and then I can make a soundscape relatively quickly. Other times it takes a long time, because maybe the sounds I'm working with aren't as crisp or clear as I want them to be, and so I use like an overlay of other sounds to kind of bring like that repetition that I need. I think just the composition in general, like if you don't have to stick within your own range of research to understand. And another example of that is the idea of, how I fuse my photography with the music. Well, last year I was looking at, album covers, and how album covers can match maybe the mood of what the music is going to be, and how it's important to match those visuals with the sounds, just because it helps like program us to be prepared for what we're about to experience. So yeah, I think it's important to step outside of maybe that soundscape genre, sound art genre in general. Yes, that's my niche and that's what I need to focus on, but because there's a big world of music out there, you can really find influence anywhere.
I completely agree. And as well as that, and I'm not saying remotely, the question I asked a while ago about it, if you could only pick one of these, which would it be, is a specious question. You don't have to pick one, but part of a challenge that I think everyone faces is that we all get pigeonholed into being the black metal guy, the feminism person, all of these things. We get pigeonholed into those, whereas our research is always going to be a little bit more wide, a little more lively, a little more porous than those kind of things. And I think when you ask the question again, what is a soundscape? I think I may be dropping this in for people who might be earlier in their PhD journey than you, but I find often that people trip up over the definite article, that they think, okay, so I'm doing a PhD on soundscapes. I have to know what a soundscape is. Then I have to make the right soundscapes, and I have to make stuff that fits that definition. Whereas if anything, what we're trying to do is say, look, there are many, many possible things that could be soundscapes. These people care about it being this, and these people care about it being that. But you have to work out where you situate along those lines. There isn't one correct soundscape or one correct meditation technique or anything.
No, and I think allowing yourself to fail is also okay. because there's a lot of pieces that I've either half finished or that I didn't really start. There's a lot of field recordings that I have that I'm not going to use, and so that's stuff that could work for like the appendix of my thesis, no big deal. Some of the stuff I posted on my YouTube channel I'm not necessarily happy about or proud of, and so that opens a new discussion, right? And this is something that could be contributing to my thesis. Okay, well, why is it I don't like this? Why is this not evoking relaxation to me? And it's important to kind of do that with even artists as well. Okay, well, these are the people that I feel like inspire me, but who doesn't inspire me, and why am I not going in this direction?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I would take it a step further than that. I have asked for corrections in PhDs that I've seen before that didn't talk enough about failure, that only talked about the final products, and I got no sense of the process, because the process is exactly where you make those decisions, those inflection points where you realize that the reason you're making soundscapes is because of the effect they have on meditation, or the effect they have on how you listen. And that those inflection points are different for everybody. Again, another person might have started the exact same PhD as you, but realized on listening to Soundscapes that it was really to do with, I don't know, something. They could have taken the visual side so totally as being the important bit. Who cares about meditation? I'm just going to focus on how these visuals line up with these things. And that could have just been a whole different fork to it. But yeah, I would say those things that you're unhappy with are things that you don't consider to be going into the final portfolio. I think they should definitely be in an appendix, and they should be in there to show when your decisions went a different way, when something helped you realize what it was you were looking at. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Which also brings me up the question then about, oh, where was this going? Yes, with some things like that, are you unhappy with them for artistic reasons or for research reasons? And again, that's an artificial distinction, but it's like, did you not like how the artistic work sounded, or did it not answer a question in a useful way?
Typically, I would say most of the time it's artistic. Artistically, I don't like it. It could be for a variety of reasons. Like, for instance, I was doing a walk in Windsor, and yeah, they have a really nice park there and stuff, but they were doing construction there that day, and it's like, my primary focus of my research is nature walks. So yeah, I do urban walks and things like that, and I can use those sounds to make soundscapes, and I have done so. But for the rest of my PhD creative practice, I just want to focus on nature. So I did a recording, no big deal, of some of the birds chirping with the construction sounds. But then when I re-listened to it, they had a radio playing in the background too, and it's like, okay, well, do I want to use that as part of my field recording? It's a matter of making those tough decisions. Like another example, and Richard and I actually talked about this the last time we had a conversation, and I live really close to a church, and I can hear it from my flat, and I really like the sounds of everyone singing, and I like the organ, but I don't want to have like that much familiarity in my work. I want it to be authentically myself when I make these things, and I feel like if it's some music that's already composed in any which way, I don't really want to incorporate it in my soundscapes. And that's another thing is, okay, well, why do I make this decision? And that's why I have to explore that decision a little bit more, because it's so easy for me to just say, oh, I'm not interested in it. It's a lot harder to be like, okay, well, why? And that's another, like, coming full circle to the blog situation, is that when I am able to kind of like use my blog as a diary, because sometimes I forget certain things about the creative process. It's nice to go back there and use these as reference points. Oh, okay, I can see what I did that day and why I made the decisions that I make, and then I can put that into my thesis later down the road.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I always advise students to find some way. It mightn't be a blog or a public-facing blog, but to find some way to reflect on how you felt at that moment when the thing was happening. In 90% of artistic practices, that's the bit that you lose quickest. It's the thing that flies away. But it's also interesting to the way you were talking about that makes me think about that sense of, when you're doing a PhD, it feels like the world in some ways, in that it is your whole artistic persona, and it is your whole, or maybe it just did for me, but there's the difference between an artist for whom all of those decisions matter, and then the same set of decisions in a research context, maybe some of them don't matter for research reasons at all. Like the last piece I wrote had some really nice chords in it, but research-wise, they weren't doing anything useful. They're just some nice chords that I like. It doesn't matter to me. They could have been different chords and the research would still be exactly the same. So that's not something I'm going to waste time talking about, because for the people I'm trying to get it through to, it's a footnote at best. Whereas for someone else writing exactly the same piece of music, it's quite possible that those chords were really, really the key research aspect of it, and they made something happen. So maybe it is something they need to talk about. I guess what I'm getting at is that the artistic side of stuff is sometimes absolutely key to the research, and is sometimes just a thing that was there to make stuff happen. That the research is kind of a filtered viewpoint on the whole artistic side of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because now that we've talked about this, I'm kind of reconsidering my answer, because I do say, like, yeah, it is an artistic decision, but like I said, my research is focused only on nature walks. So why is it I'm taking all these recordings of other things that I hear? I don't know. It's just what inspires me. But I don't want to put that in my PhD project. So that's something I can do outside of that, you know?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fine to talk about that or there's a point in methodology where you'll talk about the larger artistic process that you do, and then the bit of that focuses more on what's the research that I take forward from this. So I think it's exactly right to talk about it. The only trick is to be clear about which bits of this are the bit I think are important for other people going forward as research, and which bits are just part of my process. I say just, they're absolutely vital, but they could have been done differently, and the research would still be, would still work out in the same way. Rich, I'm conscious that you might want, there might be other questions you've got, or you might want to bring other people in. So feel free to interrupt the flow at any time.
Well, now it's a great flow to listen to. Actually, the two of you coming back and forth, I think it's really good. I mean, it's a nice place to see if anyone has any questions or comments. Thanks again to Madison. This is great, you know, to really hear about your thoughts on all of this. If any of the other PhD students here want to ask something that relates to their own work as well, please do ask in the chat or come on audio.
Yeah, maybe if people have a question, just either stick a hand up in the chat, and then we'll take a break from conversation and let you jump in, rather than sitting and waiting and hoping somebody pipes up.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, go ahead, Scott.
Did you have a question?
I was going to. I was going to jump to. I suppose it's a slightly more pragmatic thing. The point about failure and exploring that. See, I agree entirely with what you said, Madison. And Scott, you said that can appear in the appendix, which yes, can work. But there's a really interesting discussion for every single, well, each one of us, practice researchers, PhD or working post PhD, what goes in the appendix and what goes in the narrative, in whatever form the appendix is, because sometimes that failure, that one specific failure in year 2 was key, but then a series of things that didn't work out in a research context, but didn't play such a key role, perhaps go in the appendix. I don't know, Scott, I'm not sure I have a particular question there, but it's an interesting balance.
I have some thoughts on this. This is one of the places where an artistic practice PhD, the part of the detritus of that gets in our way a little bit, because again, different disciplines might have a different point of view on this, but if what I submit to my PhD, the unit of submission is pieces, I submit compositions, you might submit short stories, or maybe your PhD is just one novel. What do you put in the appendix then? All the broken bits of novel that didn't go in, or all the other novels you wrote? The point you make about that little piece of evidence, I think, is really important here, because thinking of the artistic products as evidence is a really useful way to think about it, because then with something, to answer that very specific question, maybe it is something where there was one soundscape you were doing where there was just one little moment that made you go, oh, that's important and that's an inflection point, but it doesn't need to put the whole piece in the portfolio because it's just that bit that mattered. So if this was a traditional PhD, you would just need to put in an extract from a score or something. You don't need to see the whole piece, you just need to see the extract. That's not going to work for something like a soundscape, but I would definitely encourage things like having a folder that says examples. So you can say to someone, go listen to example 4 and you'll see exactly what I mean. And if you want to see the whole rest of that piece, go look in the appendix, it's in there. So I think the appendix is always for stuff that the assessor does not need to hear, but is available if they want to expand a sense of what's going on. Anything that needs to be there to make the point, to act as evidence, to etc., that needs to be for upfront, even if it's not the full piece in itself, even if it's just a 30-second extract, because that's the bit that mattered.
Artistic product as evidence. I think it's a really, really strong concept. Yeah,
but even at that, it's not the entire product, it's just a chunk from it. A colleague of mine always makes the example of he did a huge project, and he had all of these, he was a theater maker, and he had all of these plays and, you know, really nicely videotaped things, but actually the bit that came out of the project that led to the next project was 20 seconds on like an iPhone camera of a rehearsal somewhere, and it was a bit where they just spotted something and they had a huge realization, and that was the thing. And he could just say, watch these 20 seconds and then you'll see how we got to the next bit. Didn't need the rest of it, didn't need the whole rehearsal, the play, nothing else. It was just that bit. I think that's the articulating bit. It's the bit that convinces.
And that can be workshop or rehearsal. 1 minute from an interview with an actor that you were working with outside of the workshop, but you happen to have the camera recording. Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on Madison mentioning autoethnography, which is something that we've been touching on a bit recently, and I suspect there'll be a few of the PhD students here who might be thinking about, well, when do I talk in the first person? When do I describe my own creative process in the third person? And it can seem kind of formalized. This again links back to the dearth of models, right? The fact that there are very few examples really that we have. Repositories are growing gradually. It's a bit in the abstract, but I mean, do you have particular perspectives on that, Scott? And then we could talk a bit about how Madison might be thinking about using it.
Yeah, for sure. This is a methodologies question, in the sense that whenever you're importing a methodology from somewhere else, the first thing you have to do is understand how it's used in that other place, even if how you're going to use it isn't the same, so that you can at least explain in your commentary somewhere, yes, this is autoethnography, this is how it's done in its parent discipline, here's how other people I've seen do it, I'm going to use it this way because I think this worked best for me. Arguably it's not still autoethnography, or maybe it is, but I'm going to use that term because it's the closest term that fits. So just making it's situating, it's making it clear to the reader that you understand the tool that you're using, and you understand how it works for what you want to do. But I think then in that case, all those questions you asked about, like when am I in the first person or the third, etc., and models, at least when you are importing a methodology from somewhere else, you can always go back and look at those models where it came from. And then the trick, I think, is in something Madison was talking about earlier, which I think is really right, is in the ownership of it, in being able to say, this is how I'm using it, because this is what works for what I'm trying to do, and look, I can show you that this will work. Sorry, the cat just tried to jump in the window and then realized the window wasn't open wide enough, and that was nearly a cat disaster. So I think that's for anything, though. There's always the danger that when we import I have to stop saying that phrase, but when we use methodologies from other places, that there is we're kind of tourists to a certain extent. We're not going to we're probably not going to contribute to the larger ethnographic discussion around autoethnography, but we might well contribute to how it works or doesn't work within an artistic context. And there are, again, in terms of models, at least with something like that, there is a relatively large amount of artistic practice, PhDs and non-PhDs, that use autoethnography. So there are other people you can look at. I think it's much more difficult when you're importing something that's completely new and you just don't see how it fits.
I think that was one of the things early on, is that I was trying to put myself in these boxes and stick to it. And when I would send Richard some of like my writing and stuff, I would be kind of nervous to see his response, because I wasn't sure if I was following the rules, you know, the fake rules, but the rules I felt were real. And throughout the process, Richard's just like, think what you want, write what you want. It's no big deal. We'll narrow it down and figure it out together. And I think just having somebody outside of me say, you don't have to have it 100% correct when you submit these drafts and things like that, is fine. But I would say, like, as far as the layout goes, obviously I'll do my lit review, and that's going to be like all the research, and then the methodology section when I introduce what methods I'm using. And then after that, it will be like my reflective stuff. So like that's the current layout I'm working with at the moment. So even though I have a pretty decent chunk of my lit review and methodology section finalized, yeah, now is the time. This year I've dedicated to complete creative practice, making my music, and then doing like my own reflective work. And then it's a matter of taking those blogs or the way I think and feel, and then kind of transcribing it into like an academic sense, where I can use terms like me, my, things, I, things like that, but I have to write it in a more like academic way.
I think academic writing as well is also just really to do with clarity. That sometimes with something like a blog like that, what can be really clear to us is not necessarily easy to translate. But equally, sometimes the thing that's hard to translate is exactly the hard to translateness is part of what we're trying to get across. So, you know, not to invoke the French tradition of philosophical writing, which is sometimes trying to make things difficult because being difficult is partly what it's trying to write about. But it's, yeah, that sense of permission granting, like you said earlier, about trying to write it so it looks right. I think we're all slightly trying to do that because we're trying to make it fit in with where we think it has to go. And it's very difficult to escape that. I mean, I've written 5 articles / book chapters in the last year, and I look back on the first one just the other day, and I could see even then, because I'm relatively unused to writing those kind of things, how I could see the hedging and the kind of I could see the mask I was putting on. And then I looked at the one I'd written just a month ago, and I could see how different it was because I was now owning my own writing process, etc. Takes a while to get to that point where you feel like you're not just dressing for the job you want.
I think a lot of that has to do with like education and exposure. I mean, I can't really speak for the UK education system, but the way like I was taught was very scientific based in general. And I mean, sure, we could have taken creative writing classes in high school or even university, but that's not really the area that I went into. And so because I didn't have that exposure, I was so rigid with the way I wrote initially that it was even difficult for me to use for, like, you know, first person at all. So it's good to have supervisors that kind of recognize your struggle, because sometimes you don't even realize you're doing this stuff. And so it was good to have Richard as part of the team, because he was able to be like, okay, well, you can be a little bit more open to what you're discussing. You don't have to be so rigid and structured. And I think that's another issue with like having anxiety, is you have like this sense of perfectionism as well, and being a people pleaser and all this other stuff that like factors into the writing. And it's like you're given a set of rules that you think are rules, you perceive as rules, and you feel like when you don't write that certain way, you're not good enough, you don't fit in, things like that. And so it's good to have a support system that's basically like, hey, it's okay, you don't have to be perfect. Yeah.
I think it's it's important what Scott said about if you're taking methodologies from elsewhere, explaining how those have been used elsewhere, and then how and why you're using them. And I think it's not uncommon for there to be a difference in terms of a lot of people journal or bullet point as they go, or write swathes of dialectical writings, and then later on, with perhaps a wider methodological knowledge, fit them into a kind of writing that has a purpose, so that there is okay, this is why I'm writing. It's effectively data collection earlier on, and then that then becomes how you are analysing it. I want to just draw our attention to the chat. So Georgia, who has left now. Yes.
Oh, just before you change tack into the chat, I just want to throw in two things on that. One, this is mine. The amount of voice memos I leave to myself on research. This is my research right here. You have a blog, I have voice memos. Like, there's everything in here from 40-second long things that at 1 a.m. I suddenly went, oh, I won't remember this tomorrow, and I tell myself, versus there are hour-long voice messages here of me going on a walk and just explaining to myself how I'm going to write this article. I don't always listen back to them, but they're there, and the data is there, and I can go back and interrogate it when I need to. But I also think that a part of this thing is exactly what you were saying a second ago, Rich, is about, it's about layers of distance and us becoming the tree and the bark, etc. That the thing that we think right then, there's a point in the PhD process where we have to go and kind of stand outside it and look at it and say, how do I translate this into something productive? It's taking the thing that was really meaningful at that moment and turning that meaning, that insight for you, into an insight for other people.
And you're saying you don't always listen back to those voice memos, but that's the process that you take. In the same way that Madison going and undertaking the walks, going for the nature walks, which sometimes result in something, sometimes don't, but it's the act of doing those walks.
Yeah.
It's always about understanding the things you are doing that you need to in order for something to emerge, not always, but sometimes.
Yeah. Sorry, you were going to the chat.
Brenda has left a great message. I don't know if, Brenda, you want to come on audio and chat, but that's a really interesting point you're talking about, failure to capture the appropriate material and how that's changed. Do you want to come on? It doesn't matter if you're not able to.
It's fine. It's just that I was getting really cross because I was going into a live situation, and then when I get home, I realised I hadn't quite got what I wanted, and that frustration, because I've been so engaged with the moment and talking to people that I couldn't operate all the kit that I've got with a camera, and I've got a sound recorder, and I'm trying to hold a conversation, move the camera, switch things on, switch things off, and I was getting really cross at the beginning about that sort of thing happening. But lockdown, I think, was being like quite cathartic in the sense that you've got to sort of realize that, I suppose it was finding some writing that actually sort of explained that this was quite normal, and to accept the fact that that was part of the process and to work with it rather than trying to fight it. And that's been really helpful in how I approach making short films, and how now that I'm now trying to sort of develop some actual textile artifacts that are coming out of this filming in working factories where cloth is made, working mills. And I've been looking at the hand skills that remain absolutely essential in this sort of kind of work, which is quite hidden, really. High quality cloth needs someone there with a pair of scissors and a needle and thread, despite the fact that the looms are running at some phenomenal speed, and the way the warps are made is like a space rocket. You can't even see it going on because it's so fast, it's dangerous, and things like that. Everything's gone digital, but you still need a person there with good eyesight, a pair of scissors and a needle. And I find that it's been the driving force behind this fascination. But it's been the conversations, the sharing with people, because there's a group of people working together and I'm interested in what they're saying, and then realizing that you've missed this and missed that, and oh dear, when you get home, and just accepting that that is part and parcel of the process, and this is what I've achieved and not something else. And that's been a significant learning curve.
I think that's exactly true. And I think the thing to hold on to there is that, again, the point of this, and there's some disagreement about this. Some people think a practice research PhD, the practice also has to be perfect and of the highest level. Personally, I disagree with that. I'd rather see failures that have insights than perfect things that don't have insights. So it really is about capturing the insight. And if that process you went through allowed that to happen, then that's what matters. But I will throw also one minor anecdote on this, that the lovely point at the end of my PhD, when I finally realized that I didn't have to do all the things. I was writing this music that also involved this stuff working in the computer, and I was programming the computer stuff myself, and that was fine, and I was terrible at it. And I finally managed to scrape together a couple of £100 to pay a friend of mine to do that bit instead. And that was so much better, because then I could focus on the bit that really mattered to me, and he would build the bit that was fun for me to make, but I wasn't going to do it very well. In a similar way, and of course, there's all sorts of discourse here about labor and what is possible and what is not, but having someone else to do some of the things is sometimes a really productive way to allow you to focus on the bit that matters. But I also recognize that you can't sometimes realize what bit matters until you're juggling 10 things and you have to realize which one it is.
I'm kind of doing that in reverse, because I have worked with a camera person and I have a nice person to work with. The problem has been getting funding to actually take somebody with me, but also the intrusion within a working environment. I'm going into a space, I don't know the people, I don't know the space, I don't know what I'm going to encounter, and I've got to work with what is there. I can't change the lighting, I can't move things around. And so I've learned to accept that I need to do this myself, and it doesn't necessarily work better with somebody else. Gotcha. Although I do enjoy working, and I have got odd things in mind that I'd like to do again with cameraman that I've worked with, but largely I've had to accept that I have to do this on my own.
Yeah, I get that.
I mean, that's your project is part an experimentation of how to deal with that.
Yeah, I suppose it is really.
That's part of the insight too.
Yeah. Scott, that's really interesting. Yeah, the points you're saying about the product needing, some folks saying that the product needs to be perfect, or what kind of professional level, whatever that might mean in our own fields. But we can well imagine a practice research PhD that it just explores what occurs in workshops, and there's nothing about the final outcome at all. That may or may not have happened, at a major international festival or not. But that is that's the cultural performance landscape, not the experimentation landscape.
I occasionally get emails from people who want to come and do a PhD, and the opening line, well, I ask them what they want to do a PhD on, and their answer is, "Oh, I'm a really good piano player." I'm like, okay, that's a useful tool and a useful set of skills, but what's the PhD going to be on? And there's also, I recognize that there is a confusion there, because 50 years or 100 years ago, some PhDs in arts areas were seen as professional training. They weren't seen as research, but that landscape has shifted rather radically in the last generation or so.
Yes, and that's part of what can make it a bit hard to find resources. Now, Scott, when we were talking about autoethnography before, and you said, of course, there's plenty of PhD examples where artists, researchers have employed autoethnography as part of their project, as part of their investigation. So if you're wanting to find those out, what are you going to do? Google it? What are our repositories to work with here?
I'm working on it. I mean, I'm literally working on it.
Yeah.
I'm part of a project at the moment that is scoping out the potential for new repositories just for this. Frankly, at the moment, your best bet is still Google Scholar. As in, Google Scholaring will show up PhDs and things like that. A lot of the time, annoyingly, it will show you the ProQuest version, which you have to pay for, but usually if you dig a bit further into the results, or it usually says there are 3 different versions of this. One of those versions will be the proper repository version, not the ProQuest cash money one. But I don't have a good answer for this, because 9 times out of 10, when even my students are asking about things, they're not finding what they need, and I'm able to feed them the few things I know, but that's just in my existing network. It's not the wholeness of knowledge. I guess the only other useful thing to say perhaps to people who are at the start of this journey is change your keywords a lot, because a lot of the time, well, sometimes when you're hunting these things down, you conceive of something as being one word, but the people who are talking about it are using a slightly different word. So, for example, it was really useful again where Madison was talking about immersion, because you could be looking for something to do with meditation but not use the word immersion, and suddenly you're missing out on a whole swathe of people who are talking about it in that way. So multiple searches that use related keywords rather than the word you think about it might open things up a little bit more, but also maybe not. Sorry, I don't have a good question to this other than talk to me in a year and I might have an answer.
Research in the digital age with your strategic use of keywords, yes. We mentioned the Journal of Artistic Research before. It's not necessarily a PhD project, folks, but it's a great repository of different ways of discussing, ways of articulating research. But yeah, well, the flip side is it's exciting because you're all in the vanguard of creating these different models. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure I must make sure, Scott, that when that project starts to yield good stuff, that I get that sent around to all of you good folks here, so that we've got some more information on that. But I think all the important things about situating work, if you're utilizing methods elsewhere, situate your work within that, understand how it's been used. Those are all good lines of advice. Any more comments or questions? We've happily skipped through an hour and 3/4. Yeah. And Madison, we sort of drifted off there. I think we sort of came to a natural conclusion. I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to add.
I like what Brenda said earlier about having a driving force behind her research and what keeps her propelling forward. And I think a lot of us in the middle of our PhD research, we tend to get really overwhelmed and we don't really know which direction we want to go. And I think just having that driving force is what helps push us forward and help complete the project. But sometimes, we lose that force. Sometimes people end up leaving and not pursuing the rest of their degree. And I think that's another conversation to have in itself, is how do you continue your research whenever you're starting to feel kind of depleted? Maybe you're not going in the right direction. Maybe you're failing too much. I mean, there could be so many factors, but I think having that main force pushing you is what's going to help. And obviously with mine, I would say it's just the meditation aspect in general. I would be doing these walks whether I was in a PhD program or not. So that's my driving force, is just having that relaxation experience. But others might have something else like that would push them that way. I don't know if you guys have anything to say about that.
If you'll excuse the salty language, I'm going to link people to the Thesis Whisperers article on the Valley of Shit. It's not the best. Well, it's not the best. There are lots of people who have written about this phenomenon that at some point in a long research project like a PhD, you're going to get to that point where you're like, what is the point of all this? I don't understand what I'm asking anymore. What even is this? And that can last for a week, or it can last for 2 or 3 months. And for some people, it means just hanging up their boots and saying, this is not what I was after. And some people turn a corner and find something to do with it. But I think it's well worth people reading other people's experience around this, because it is a difficult time, and you also feel like you can't talk to anyone else because you're now the bad student or something, or you're not working, or there's all of these anxiety and identity issues that creep up with it. But yeah, so hearing other people talk about it, not even necessarily how they found their way out of it, but just talking about it, I think is really helpful. But you're absolutely right. That is something that exists for all of us. And it doesn't necessarily stop post-PhD either. I've also had large projects that have gone through this kind of thing. Was that what you were getting at with this, or have I jumped onto a separate point?
No, that was exactly what I was getting at. I think you summed it up a lot better than me, but that's okay.
That's only because I said value of shit.
Probably.
Apart from forgetting to say, actually, it all stops once you submit the PhD and everything's fine.
Yes.
And I think that's another thing is the fact that obviously I'm not there yet, but what happens beyond the PhD? Like where am I going to go and what am I going to do? And so my PhD project is called Core Opulence. I have its own little name, its own little brand, its own little like bubble. And I plan on continuing on working on that, you know, past the PhD, because I can see myself always taking photos. It's something I've done ever since I picked up my first camera, and I feel like it's just going to be a continuation. Like it might not obviously be the same exact thing as what I'm working on, but I feel like it's always going to be a part of me, and I'm going to just continue on building that concept. And it's interesting because it's like I can really go in so many different directions after I graduate. Like, of course, I could be a lecturer, but I wouldn't mind doing things like maybe hosting like online meditation retreats or things like that as well, just to make that art and then have more interaction with it. Because like I said, right now it's mostly autoethnography, but I like the idea of doing those in-person experiences as well. And I've been asked to do 2 in-person experiences, one in the end of March and one I think towards May. And it will be my first time doing something like this with my PhD, so it will give me experience, and then obviously the confidence will come with that, the knowing how to set things up aspect, and then I can start branching out and doing this on my own, you know.
I really like the way you talk about that. I'm going to drop 2 links to people I know who, while both of them post PhD have done a certain amount of other academic work, they're also part of the practices that both of these people, Paula Kramer and Alex DeLittle, both developed, was a practice that also exists outside the PhD and not simply their artistic practice. So Paula, for example, she's a German movement artist, and her PhD was all about movement and materialism. And like she like moves through rocks. Well, she doesn't move through them, but she moves with rocks and things like that. She moves with materials, and now she has this really nice external practice where she brings other people through that. So she developed her practice not just as an artistic practice, but as a way to help other people connect to the land, and it's also got meditative aspects, etc. Similarly, my former student Alex, his PhD was around sound as sound in spaces, basically acoustics, and harnessing the power of acoustics and doing things with that on a purely artistic level. But his PhD, as it went on, became a PhD about listening, and it became about finding ways to help people listen. And he did all these he made 3D printed bat ears at one point you could put onto people so they could hear like a bat, and lots of things like this. But what he developed out of this was a practice that he can bring to anywhere, where he gets people in a space and he has all these exercises for getting them to listen to the space in different ways and listen to each other. And as part of that, he connected to the community of practice around Pauline Oliveros's deep listening, and he became a certified deep listening practitioner. But that's not all he does. That's one aspect of it, but he has this other kind of separate listening thing, which is related but similar, which is my long-winded way of saying the way you're thinking about this, I think, is exactly right. But developing a practice, but also maybe connecting with communities of practice who do similar things is a useful way. And also seeing how they turn that into a career of any sort is also useful. Long-winded answer there.
That's all right. Yeah, that was pretty much it on my end. I'm
thanks, Madison.
All those questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I'm wafting through all the links that Scott's given us, which is great. Yeah, it's Alex's page is really nice. It's really nice to get out. Okay, all right. Well, look, if there's no more questions or comments from folks, then we can draw it to a close there. Let me first see if Ross is still here. The anticipatory pause.
I am here.
Yes. Hello, Prof. Ross. Do you want to just talk about the next session in this series?
Yes, I'd be glad to. So thank you, Richard, and thank you, Scott. Lots of interesting material today. A lot of topics, each one of them actually could be a 2-hour session, you know, from how art-based researchers have borrowed upon social science methodologies because they didn't have the confidence or the language or the, you know, to do their own research that happens quite naturally. And so terms like autoethnography crept in, you know, which doesn't need to, you know, if we're artistic researchers. So all that sort of stuff, as well as, you know, what does this end thing look like? What, you know, at the University of Wolverhampton, our practice-based PhDs, up to 45,000 words, written words, and the rest is a portfolio of material that you can submit for that. So our next session is going to have a look at what this thing or things might be at the end, how to reveal them in a way that is true to artistic research and is helpful. So it's all about moving away from the notion of an exhibition, which I think ties nicely, Scott, into what you were saying earlier, into something that is an exposition, something that reveals the research process, rather than, say, an end professional piece of work that you tack on the end of this bit that you've written, you know. So that was a bit alarming. I saw this thing fly up. Yes, it's a cat's tail. So I think this, you know, our next session kind of moves on quite nicely. So we've entitled it, How Do You Show It? Exposition and the epistemic object in artistic doctoral research. So we're looking at that, the object that creates the knowledge, you know, or the objects that create the knowledge here, how to reveal those, how to share those. One of those things also that Scott mentioned about the how are we sharing this across the world? You know, some really good practice gets hidden, not shared, not accessible even to anyone else. So we'll be covering that aspect as well. Dr. Maxine Bristow is going to give us a presentation on her experiences with that, certainly coming from more of a visual arts background. She's worked with Professor Carol Gray and Professor Julian Mallins, and Julian certainly done a lot of work in the visual representations websites and interactive ones as well to show this work. So I think it's going to be a really interesting session. And we've got 2 PhD students who are going to talk about their journey. And one of them is our own PhD student, Claire Vosserman, who is very adept at using reflective sketchbooks in a really rich and interesting way. So she's going to take us through that and some of her thinking about how she's going to tackle the exposition. It's going to probably, the whole session will have a bit of a more of a visual arts slant on it as opposed to today, but actually it's just as relevant for any art form. And I guess when you're talking earlier about finding, you know, search terms, yes, I think people miss out on a lot of really good work because they're not finding the right search terms, and therefore they assume it doesn't exist. And, you know, I come from a tradition of using the term art-based research, meaning all art forms, because I like to own the art that we do. I don't like to hide that away. I think what we do is artistic and it is rooted in art, no matter the form. And Sean McNiff has been doing this work. Well, he's arguably the father of art-based research for 50 years, 50 years. So some people are just discovering it in the last, you know, 5 years, but it's been going for some time. And certainly the expressive art therapies crowd have been doing it quite a long time in the United States. So looking at their work, drawing upon what they've learned. In this country, it was performance art that kind of led the way, I think, and opened things up. But even their interpretation from the early stages has changed to the way we like to see artistic research now, I think. You know, it's embedded a lot, you know, and it's crossing over into different disciplines. So it's hugely exciting times, I think, you know, but but don't think we're just inventing it in this moment. There's a lot there, and I think people need to, artistic research, art-based research. If you stick an S on it, you'll find some material too, arts-based, but that's slightly problematic. That's Elliot Eisner and Tom Barone's work that was rooted in education, which can take you into a bit of a social science route. So art-based, singular, meaning all art forms, is probably going to get you closer to artistic research. That's just a tip for those who are doing some terminology searches, really. So some really good stuff, and we're picking up on that next session. I put it in the chat when that is, with the link. And it would be really good if people could cut and paste that and distribute it on your social networks and get as many people along as possible, because I think even supervisors don't understand how you can best do this final thing, really. So colleagues, please, get them to join in. It's not just for students. I mean, vital for them, but also for supervisors. I think Wednesday, the 6th of April, 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. The Eventbrite link is there in the chat, and we will record it as well, and people can access it in non-real time, which is sort of a preference in this brave new world. And then, as Richard said, we've got a third session. Metca's looking at intellectual property when it comes to these things that we create. We will give you the full details about that, because we haven't got all the full script of that. We'll give you those details on the 6th of April. That's the third and final in our short series that we've had this year. I think very stimulating. So thank you for today.
Thank you, Ross. Yeah, it will be on Metca's talk will be on the 8th of June, Wednesday the 8th of June, folks. But we'll be sending more information. And thanks, Ross, for putting that in the chat. That's really helpful. Great. All right. We are almost at 4 o'clock. Scott, thank you so much for your time today. Some really nice messages coming through from people. So you've clearly been inspiring people away. So thank you. And thank you also to Madison. We really appreciate you putting your work out there. Go ahead, Scott.
Just two things. The slides, I did put them right up at the top of the chat there if anyone wants to take the slides. I've also dropped my email address in. More than happy to chat with anyone about further stuff on this. Ross, thank you for letting me know about the upcoming thing. That looks really interesting. And some of that epistemic object stuff is in the Ben Spatz book that I was pushing to people earlier. Well worth a look. But I also really wanted to thank Madison for the conversation and for just jumping in and being happy to talk about her work. It was really great. I really enjoyed it. Rich, thank you for inviting me as well.
Great. Well, let's make this the first of many of these kinds of things. Hey, this is a community that we're trying to develop, Ross and I in particular. And I think this session and the next session as well in April, I think that'll really help to strengthen it. Thank you all so much for coming along today. Really good to hear comments and questions and hear about different projects. Scott, thank you again. Really insightful. Okay, and we will finish there, folks. Bye then. Have a lovely rest of your Wednesday.
Bye.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Bye.